What if I told you that behind the glittering facades of the Victorian era lay a ruthless, soul-chilling machine for exploiting people? Brace yourself, because what you're about to hear will shatter all your romantic myths about that era. The hidden truth that historians have kept quiet for centuries lies in the incredible, simply horrifying price of the perfect order in the homes of the English aristocracy. Have you ever wondered who was behind all that luxury? Thousands of young women were transformed daily into living, yet utterly invisible cogs in the machine, ensuring the comfort of their capricious and demanding masters. With no room for error, no right to an opinion of their own, they literally ruined their health, toiling from dawn to dusk in huge damp mansions, scrubbing miles of stone floors with ice-cold water. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. I've saved the worst for last. Be sure to watch this video all the way through and you'll learn how these young women actually survived under conditions of total control, psychological pressure, and exhausting labor that literally shattered their lives. I promise, this story won't leave you indifferent. Give it a like in advance, subscribe to the channel, and let's dive in. A secret passed down from generation to generation lies hidden in the architecture of Old English estates. The vast house was strictly divided into two completely isolated zones. In the grand halls, the owners enjoyed art and engaged in leisurely social conversation. Behind hidden doors lay a complex network of narrow corridors and dark stone staircases. This secret infrastructure was created specifically for the movement of the numerous service staff. The women moved through the house like shadows, remaining completely invisible to the owners. The servants themselves were also subject to an extremely strict internal career hierarchy. At the top of this pyramid stood the housekeeper, whose authority over the other servants was absolute. She wore a heavy bunch of keys on her belt and controlled the distribution of all supplies in the house. Below them in rank were the mistress's personal maids, who had the right to enter the opulent bedrooms. Ordinary chambermaids performed the main work of cleaning and washing the rooms. The lowest rung was occupied by dishwashers, who were entrusted with the heaviest kitchen work. Each rung of this ladder dictated strict rules of conduct and daily interaction. Junior maids were not allowed to speak to the housekeeper without her direct permission. During lunch in the kitchen, a strict seating order was observed at the long wooden table. The seats at the head of the table were reserved exclusively for the senior and most respected servants. The dishwashers huddled at the very edge of the wooden bench, often making do with cold leftovers. Such a division created an atmosphere of constant tension within the closed female community. Advancement to a higher position required many years of impeccable and quiet service. A girl might start working in the laundry, washing heavy linen sheets in boiling water. After a few years, she might be transferred to serve as an assistant to the head maid. This status entitled her to wear a cleaner uniform and work on the upper floors. However, the slightest misstep would instantly cast her back to the very bottom of this hierarchy. The promotion system depended entirely on the mood of the senior maids and the employer's whim. The estate's owners rarely knew the names of their junior maids. To them, the numerous staff of workers blended into a faceless mass in identical dark dresses. The aristocrats interacted only with the butler or the housekeeper, relaying orders exclusively through them. Upon encountering a maid in the hallway, the master of the house would simply walk past, completely ignoring her. The girl, meanwhile, was required to turn her back to the wall and lower her eyes to the floor. Such behavior underscored the absolute social chasm between two different worlds. The servants' quarters were permeated with the smells of lye soap, dampness, and burning coal. The basement rooms had no large windows, so a thick twilight always reigned there. The walls of the kitchens and laundry rooms were covered with a layer of gray soot from the constantly burning stoves. In this stifling atmosphere, the women spent most of their waking lives. They went up to the upper floors only with heavy buckets and stiff brushes in their hands. The luxury of the master's room stood in stark contrast to the harsh austerity of these work areas. A complex system of mechanical copper bells was used for communication between floors. Dozens of bells of various sizes and tones hung in the basement corridors. Beneath each one was a plaque bearing the exact name of the master's room. Upon hearing the bell, a maid had to immediately drop what she was doing and run upstairs. A delay of even a single minute was considered a gross violation of work discipline. This incessant ringing became the dominant sound in the life of any servant of that era. Architects deliberately designed the service staircases to be incredibly narrow and steep. This saved space for creating spacious reception halls with high ceilings. The maids had to climb these high steps every day carrying enormous trays. In their hands, they carried hot water, coal, or stacks of clean iron linens. Balancing on narrow wooden planks with such a load was incredibly difficult. Any awkward movement could result in damage to the master's valuable property. The maid's entire life was devoted to maintaining the perfect machinery of the vast estate. Her own desires, talents, and interests were completely ignored by this ruthless system. Her personality was erased, giving way to a set of strictly regulated physical functions. She became merely a tool for creating the master's comfort and coziness. This invisible labor was the solid foundation of all the wealth of Victorian society. Without these women, the luxurious mansions would have turned into cold stone ruins. The realization of their invisibility weighed heavily on the young workers' minds. They lived amidst incredible wealth, yet had no right to touch it for their own pleasure. This injustice was perceived as the natural order of things, one that could not be changed. Do you agree with this? Please share your thoughts on the matter. Every opinion is valuable, so be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new videos. Are you ready for the shocking truth about the schedule that turned people into machines? A typical London maid's workday began at exactly 5 in the morning. At that hour, pitch darkness and thick dampness still hung outside the window. The girl had to quickly wash her face with ice-cold water from a ceramic jug. She had no more than 5 minutes to get dressed in her strict uniform. After that, a non-stop series of grueling physical tasks began for the entire day. The maid's first duty was to clean the fireplaces on the lower reception floors. She had to shovel heavy ashes into metal buckets and carry them outside. Then she polished the cast iron grates with a special paste until they shone a deep black. After that, the fireplace had to be stoked again, bringing in heavy baskets of coal. All this work was done in complete silence so as not to wake the sleeping masters. While the fire was getting going, the maid began cleaning the formal rooms and halls. She dusted the massive carved furniture with a slightly damp linen cloth. The carpets were cleaned with stiff brushes while the girl knelt in an uncomfortable position. The wooden floors were rubbed with beeswax until they gleamed like a mirror. This procedure required an incredible amount of physical effort every day. By 7 o'clock in the morning, the house had to look absolutely spotless and clean. The maids hurried to the kitchen for jugs of hot water for the master's morning ablutions. They carried these heavy ceramic vessels up the steep service staircases. Each bedroom required separate service and the utmost attention from the staff. A maid would quietly knock on the door, leave the water, and discreetly disappear into the hallway. Breakfast for the owners was served in a spacious dining room with large, bright windows. The maids arranged the silver cutlery and porcelain plates according to strict geometric rules. The distance between the fork and the knife was measured literally with a wooden ruler. Snow-white tablecloths were smoothed out with heavy irons right on the long dining table. Not a single wrinkle was to spoil the perfect appearance of the morning meal. The maids themselves were only allowed time for a quick breakfast after the masters had finished their meal. They gathered in the kitchen, eating oatmeal and bread with the dregs of weak tea. Exactly 20 minutes were allotted for the meal, with no time for long conversations. Immediately after that, the second phase of the daily large-scale cleaning of the premises began. Now the masters' bedrooms with their unmade high beds awaited them. Changing the bedding required the participation of 2 physically strong young women at once. The enormous feather mattresses had to be fluffed and turned over on both sides every day. Heavy woolen blankets were carefully smoothed out and tucked tightly under the mattress. Then the chamber pots and dirty water from washing were carried out of the rooms. The bedroom was aired out, and the fire in the fireplace was stoked again with fresh coal. The afternoon was devoted to washing, ironing, and mending various items of clothing. The laundry room was filled with thick steam from large copper cauldrons that were constantly boiling. Fabrics were scrubbed on wooden boards with hard soap, chafing the skin on their hands. Irons were heated directly on the red-hot stove and weighed several kilograms. Ironing had to be done with incredible care so as not to scorch the expensive, delicate fabrics. In the evening, the pace of work picked up again before the wealthy master's late supper. The maids once more carried hot water, lit candles, and kindled heavy oil lamps. They helped set the table for dinner and washed mountains of dirty, greasy dishes. In the kitchen, work was in full swing as pots and pans were scrubbed with coarse river sand. The workday ended closer to midnight when the house finally fell asleep. Such a routine left the women no time even for a proper night's rest. Constant fatigue became their constant companion for many long years. The lack of days off turned life into an endless cycle of hard physical labor. Do you think a modern person could endure such a grueling routine? In the next chapter, you'll learn about the unique methods they use to achieve sterile cleanliness.
Yes, ma'am. We're almost done.
What the government doesn't want you to know pales in comparison to the strict rules of Victorian contracts. Every girl who was hired signed a document that stripped her of any freedom of choice. The rules strictly regulated the length of the dark dress, the color of the stockings, and the shape of the white bonnet. Wearing any jewelry, even the simplest wooden rings, was strictly forbidden by the housekeeper. Hair had to be tucked tightly under the headdress without a single strand left loose. Leaving the estate was permitted only at strictly defined, rare times. A maid could not leave the grounds of the house without written permission from the head housekeeper. Any visits from relatives or village friends were completely prohibited by the rules of the household. The owners believed that outside contacts distracted the servants from performing their direct work duties. For a young woman, the house became a securely locked cage with no right to leave. The maid's personal belongings were regularly subjected to thorough and humiliating searches. The housekeeper had every right to open a maid's wooden trunk at any time. She looked for hidden candle stubs, books, or unauthorized food from the lower kitchen. Finding a single sugar cube could be grounds for immediate dismissal with great disgrace. The right to privacy in a Victorian household simply did not exist for the servants. Relationships between men and women within the household were strictly controlled by management. Conversations between grooms and maids were discouraged and often punished with deductions from wages. In some large households, separate staircases were built for male and female servants. Pregnancy meant immediate dismissal without pay or a letter of recommendation. The girl found herself on the street with no chance of finding a new, decent job. Interaction with the employers was also subject to a strict code of social invisibility. A maid had no right to initiate a conversation with a lady or a wealthy gentleman. Answers to questions should be brief, spoken as quietly as possible, and accompanied by a mandatory curtsy. Looking the masters directly in the eye was considered an incredible audacity and an unforgivable rudeness. Servants were expected to blend into the wallpaper, becoming a silent part of the room's interior. The system of letters of recommendation was the main tool for maintaining absolute power. Without a positive reference from a previous employer, it was impossible to find a new position. Estate owners often threatened to ruin a recommendation for the slightest misstep. This forced maids to endure any whims and unjust accusations directed at them. A piece of paper meant far more than the worker's actual skills and diligence. There were particularly strict rules regarding attendance at mandatory Sunday church services. Servants were required to sit on the farthest wooden benches near the entrance to the church. Their clothing had to be clean, but as modest and inconspicuous as possible to those around them. After the long service, they were not allowed to linger in the square to chat with townspeople. They were ordered to quickly return to their duties in the vast manor house. Reading fiction was considered an extremely harmful pastime for ordinary female servants. Housekeepers believed that secular novels fostered unnecessary fantasies and criminal laziness. The only permitted reading material in the cramped servants' quarters was an old Bible. Writing letters home was allowed only during the rare hours of a brief Sunday rest. All intellectual life was confined to the damp walls of stuffy kitchens and cramped laundry rooms. These strict boundaries shaped obedient and inconspicuous executors of someone else's unyielding will. Women lost their individuality, turning into perfect machines for daily cleaning. Their physical labor was cheaply valued, and their freedom was confined by the estate's high wrought iron fences. If you're interested in learning about these hidden historical facts, be sure to like this video. Your feedback helps us create more in-depth documentary stories about the past. Guess what happened next when cleanliness standards became incredibly strict? In the 19th century, there were no chemical sprays or convenient electric vacuum cleaners. All housework required brute physical strength and incredible ingenuity. To clean metal surfaces, maids used fine river sand and ordinary salt. They scrubbed the dishes for hours on end until the copper began to shine like gold. Removing dust from huge carpets was a separate, incredibly complex procedure. Maids scattered damp, used tea leaves from cheap black tea over the pile. The leaves collected small debris and prevented the acrid dust from rising into the air. After that, the carpet was thoroughly swept with stiff brushes on very short handles. The girls had to crawl on all fours through the huge halls for hours without rest. Washing the wooden floors also required special solutions and tremendous physical effort. Shavings of harsh alkaline laundry soap were dissolved in buckets of hot water. The floors were scrubbed with coarse rags while kneeling in puddles of cooling soapy water. To protect their knees, the maids tied small, thick fabric pads to their legs. However, this measure offered very little relief from the constant friction and dampness. Window panes were cleaned using old newspapers in a weak solution of table vinegar. The massive stained glass windows of the mansions consisted of dozens of small glass elements. Each piece had to be carefully wiped on both sides until perfectly clear. Work at heights was often performed without any safety equipment, standing on narrow stone ledges. Wind and cold drafts constantly hindered this painstaking and dangerous labor. Cleaning the grand hall mirrors required the utmost care and extreme caution. Maids used a special powder made from ground chalk and plain clean water. The mixture was applied to the fragile glass, left to dry, and wiped off with a soft cloth. Mirrors in gilded frames cost a fortune, and breaking them was a huge disaster. For such a mistake, a maid faced a fine far exceeding her annual earnings. The battle against soot and smoke from fireplaces was a daily, never-ending struggle. Fine black dust constantly settled on light-colored furniture, curtains, and expensive paintings. Marble fireplace mantles were washed with clean water mixed with acidic lemon juice. Carved elements were cleaned with special small brushes, penetrating every tiny crevice. This monotonous work required immense patience and perfect, sharp eyesight. Caring for the gentleman's formal attire was a true art form in those days. The dirty hems of long, heavy dresses were cleaned with a dry brush after walks outdoors. Stains on delicate silk were carefully removed using warm milk or pure alcohol. Heavy velvet fabrics were steamed over boiling water to lift the flattened nap. Shoes were polished with a mixture of hard wax and soot until they shone like a mirror. A particular challenge was the spring cleaning of the entire vast estate. During this period, all heavy window drapes and thick floor carpets were removed. Massive furniture was taken out into the courtyard for airing and deep cleaning of the upholstery. The walls were washed from top to bottom, constantly changing hundreds of buckets of murky, dirty water. The house buzzed with activity, and the servants worked at the very limit of their physical capabilities. The battle against constant dampness in old stone houses never ceased for a moment. In the cold basements and attics, dry wood shavings were regularly scattered. They absorbed excess moisture, preventing dark mold from appearing on the thick walls. The wet shavings were then collected with iron scoops and replaced with brand new ones. The smell of heavy dampness still permanently permeated the maids' uniforms. Achieving perfect cleanliness demanded total physical self-sacrifice from the workers. They expended all their strength so that the wealthy owners could enjoy impeccable comfort. This invisible daily labor went completely unappreciated by the estate's guests. How could one possibly maintain one's strength under such incredible strain day in and day out? In the next chapter, you'll learn how they ate and where they found a place to sleep. The servants' living conditions were a stark contrast to the luxury of the warm master's quarters. The young women were usually housed on the top floors, right under the mansion's roof. The cramped attic rooms lacked proper insulation against the biting wind and rain. In winter, it was bitterly cold there, and in summer, the rooms became unbearably hot from the sun. Narrow, dusty windows let in very little light, maintaining a constant, gloomy twilight. The maids' rooms were furnished as sparingly and simply as possible. Narrow iron beds with very thin mattresses stood along the peeling walls. Instead of soft down comforters, the girls slept on mattresses tightly stuffed with stiff straw. Each worker was given a small wooden chest to store her meager personal belongings. The room might contain only a single simple chair and a small, cracked wash basin. Heating in the spacious attics was practically non-existent for the sake of strict economy. The fireplaces in the servants' rooms were lit extremely rarely, only during the harshest frosts. The maids had to keep warm at night under thin, prickly woolen blankets. By morning, the water in the wash basin was very often covered with a solid crust of ice. Getting dressed in a freezing, dark room was a daily ordeal for the maids. The diet of all the servants was strictly controlled by the head housekeeper and the head chef. Their food was quite filling, but incredibly monotonous and extremely simple. The daily menu consisted mainly of thick soups, boiled potatoes, and cheap cuts of meat. They rarely, if ever, received leftovers of expensive delicacies from the master's table. Fresh seasonal fruit and exquisite sweet desserts were completely off limits to the maids. Tea, which was the main beverage of the era, was served in strictly limited portions. Servants brewed the cheapest varieties, often reusing the same leaves for a second steep. Sugar was rationed in minimal amounts, as it was quite expensive in those days. Meals were served in a noisy and incredibly stuffy basement dining room for the staff. Those who were late for dinner risked going completely hungry until late in the evening. The lack of a private, quiet space created additional intense psychological pressure. As many as 6 or 8 young women might live together in a single cramped room. They changed clothes and washed up in full view of one another every long workday. It was impossible to hide from prying eyes or enjoy absolute silence. Constant noise and bustle followed them from the moment they woke up until late at night. Lighting in the attics was provided by the cheapest and dimmest tallow candles. They gave off very little light and emitted an incredibly unpleasant odor when burning. The masters strictly monitored candle usage, forbidding them to be lit needlessly in the evenings. Reading or sewing in such dim, flickering light was incredibly hard on the eyes. As darkness fell, the cold rooms quickly plunged into absolute, thick darkness. Decorating the bedrooms was strictly forbidden by the house rules of the wealthy household. The girls were not allowed to hang paintings, drawings, or brightly colored pieces of fabric on the walls. The room was supposed to maintain a strict, barracks-like appearance without the slightest hint of extravagance. The only permitted item was a small wooden cross above the narrow bed. Any attempt to create even a modicum of comfort was nipped in the bud by the senior maids. In these Spartan conditions, the exhausted maids spent their few hours of rest. They collapsed onto hard straw beds after 16 hours of continuous, hard labor. Their exhaustion was so intense that deep sleep came almost instantly. The hard mattress felt like a soft cloud of down to a body worn out by constant running. The short night flew by unnoticed, rapidly giving way to a new workday. The contrast between the floors of the house reflected the very essence of that historical era. The luxury and comfort of some were built on the deprivation and hard labor of entirely different people. The attics remained an invisible gray zone, never visited by the wealthy aristocrats. There, real, harsh life unfolded without pretty embellishments or bookish illusions. These cold stone walls hold the memories of thousands of stories of the unseen working women of the 19th century.
Keep moving.
What lies behind the beautiful facade of formal dinners is astonishing in its scale. Preparations for the visit of important guests began several weeks before the event itself. The housekeeper compiled incredibly detailed lists of food and necessary household supplies. Dozens of carts were delivered to the house with coal, candles, and the freshest provisions. The maid's pace quickened, turning the estate into a huge, bustling hive. The formal dining room underwent a thorough cleaning before every major reception. The crystal chandeliers were lowered so that every tiny glass pendant could be washed. The oak paneling on the walls was rubbed with linseed oil until it gleamed like a mirror. The long dining table was polished with soft cloths for several hours straight. The room had to shine and demonstrate the absolute prosperity of its wealthy owners. A separate team of servants was dedicated exclusively to the meticulous polishing of the silverware. Huge trays, soup tureens, and hundreds of pieces of cutlery were taken out of sturdy, heavy safes. They were cleaned with a special chalk paste, removing even the slightest traces of dark tarnish. The silverware was laid out on green cloth-covered tables for meticulous inventory. The slightest scratch on the precious metal resulted in severe reprimands for the staff. On reception days, the kitchen turned into a sweltering and noisy production hall. Dishwashers ceaselessly washed mountains of pots, metal bowls, and wooden cutting boards. Kitchen hands chopped wood and kept the fire burning at full blast in the large stone ovens. The air was thick with the hot aromas of roasted meat, spices, and fresh bread. The heat was unbearable, but the heavy physical labor did not stop for a second. The process of serving the dishes resembled a strictly choreographed theatrical performance. Footmen and maids lined up in a chain, passing trays from the staircase to the massive doors. Only senior servants in absolutely impeccable uniforms were permitted to enter the dining room. The servers' movements had to be smooth, silent, and incredibly precise. The clatter of a porcelain plate or the clang of a dropped fork was considered an unacceptable failure. The replacement of dirty plates took place completely unnoticed by the noble guests, who were engrossed in conversation. A servant would approach from the left, clearing away the empty dishes with a single light and swift movement. New hot dishes appeared on the table, as if by the wave of an invisible magic wand. This professional invisibility of the service staff was cultivated through years of rigorous training. The gentlemen were not to be distracted by those who ensured their utmost comfort. Downstairs in the stuffy dishwashing room, a real battle was raging with the dirty dishes. Greasy plates and fragile crystal glasses poured in here in a continuous stream. The maids stood in clouds of steam, plunging their hands into hot, murky, soapy water. The delicate porcelain demanded the utmost care, despite the frantic pace of work. The cost of a single broken dinner plate, a fortune, was deducted from the maid's meager wages. Once the guests had retired to the drawing room, a thorough cleaning of the dining room began immediately. The crumpled, stained tablecloths were neatly folded and sent to the laundry baskets for a long wash. Leftovers were gathered and sent to the lower kitchen for the staff's meals. Crumbs were swept from the table into trays using special small silver brushes. The room very quickly returned to its original, austere, and immaculate state. For the entire staff, this celebration ended well past midnight, when the voices died down. When the last carriages left the courtyard, the final cleanup of the first floor began. The dishes, washed in the kitchen, were carefully dried and locked away in secure cupboards. The floors were swept again, and the cooling fireplaces were cleared of smoldering gray embers. The maids went up to their attics just as dawn was slowly breaking outside. Evenings like these clearly demonstrated the gulf between the classes in English society. Some enjoyed exquisite food and sophisticated conversation by bright candlelight. Others made this celebration possible at the cost of incredible physical exhaustion and fatigue. Could you organize such a complex process without a single mistake? In the next chapter, you'll learn why they were so afraid of losing this hard work. Losing one's job was the greatest fear of any Victorian maid. Behind the massive doors of a wealthy mansion lay the harsh world of industrial London. Tens of thousands of people searched daily for any opportunity to earn a crust of bread. Competition for a position in a respectable, wealthy household was incredibly fierce. The housekeeper always knew that a line would instantly form to replace a maid who had slipped up.
Who is ready?
Dismissal meant more than just the loss of a stable, albeit incredibly meager income. A woman would instantly lose her roof over her head and her guaranteed daily meals. Most young maids had no savings for a rainy day. Returning to her home village was often impossible due to her family's extreme poverty. Finding herself on the street without support, the young woman was on the very brink of survival. A maid's most valuable asset was a letter of recommendation from her former wealthy employers. This small scrap of written paper determined a person's fate in the 19th century. Without a good reference, the massive doors of respectable homes remained closed forever. Employers carefully verified the authenticity of recommendations by sending strict inquiries by mail. Any suspicion of dishonesty put a definitive end to one's future career. The reasons for immediate dismissal could be the most trivial and unjust. A broken, expensive porcelain cup could become the cause of a major scandal and dismissal. A defiant look or a bow that wasn't deep enough were also punished by the loss of one's job. Employers had absolutely no tolerance for arguments and demanded unquestioning, complete obedience. A maid was expected to silently endure any accusations from senior staff. Theft was considered the most terrible crime in the closed world of domestic service. The disappearance of a silver spoon or even a bar of soap triggered a thorough internal investigation. The suspect was thrown out onto the street without payment of her earned wages and with a black mark on her record. Finding a new job after a public accusation of theft was absolutely impossible. The shadow of suspicion very often fell on the most vulnerable and youngest maids. Physical weakness was also a common reason for sudden job loss. In Victorian society, there was no such thing as paid sick leave for domestic servants. If a maid could not perform her duties due to severe fatigue, she was replaced. Keeping an incapacitated worker was considered an unaffordable luxury for a strict housekeeper. The girls hid their ailments as long as they could stand on their own 2 feet. This constant gnawing fear made the servants incredibly submissive and silent. The women endured the rudeness of senior staff and the whims of their wealthy employers. They worked beyond their allotted hours, afraid to show their fatigue or the slightest discontent. The invisible threat of imminent dismissal hung in the air, forcing them to idealize cleaning. Discipline in the vast house was maintained not only by rules but also by this fear. Older maids who lost their former physical strength over the years were particularly vulnerable. As they aged, carrying heavy buckets of water up steep staircases became increasingly difficult. If a woman did not manage to work her way up to the position of housekeeper, a bleak future awaited her. Older maids were often dismissed and replaced with younger, more resilient girls. Pension benefits for domestic servants simply did not exist in those harsh times. Mutual support among the servants was often the only salvation from impending disaster. More experienced maids secretly helped the younger ones with the unbearably heavy work. They took some of the blame upon themselves to protect their young friend from the housekeeper's wrath. This hidden solidarity helped them survive the harsh conditions of the vast estate. Shared hardship brought the women closer together, turning them into something resembling a real, close-knit family. The strict hiring system was incredibly convenient for members of the upper class. It ensured the smooth operation of vast domestic machinery across the country. People were viewed as easily replaceable parts of a complex machine of domestic comfort. This harsh order persisted for many decades without encountering serious resistance. The life of a simple maid depended entirely on the will and mood of her powerful employer. The vast staff of servants functioned like an incredibly complex and precise clockwork mechanism. Each worker performed a strictly defined set of monotonous daily tasks. The division of labor allowed for perfect order to be maintained in the vast, spacious rooms. Interfering with someone else's work or helping anyone without orders was strictly forbidden by the rules. This system eliminated confusion and clearly identified those responsible for any mistakes. At the very bottom of the hierarchy were the dishwashers, who performed the menial kitchen work. They spent their days in dark basements, scrubbing huge cauldrons and greasy frying pans. Their hands were always red from the hot water and abrasive cleaning sand. The dishwashers wore the simplest clothes, ones they didn't mind getting stained with kitchen soot. Under no circumstances were they allowed to go up to the upper floors of the house. Higher in status were the maids, who were directly responsible for the cleanliness of the formal rooms. They were divided into upper and lower maids depending on their assigned area of responsibility. Their work required greater precision and the ability to handle very expensive items. They wore light, clean aprons over austere dark dresses made of cheap cotton. It was these young women who scrubbed the floors daily and blew the slightest speck of dust off the antiques. Maids assigned exclusively to the estate's guest bedrooms played a special role. During large receptions, they attended to the visiting noble aristocrats. The girls unpacked travel trunks, ironed dresses, and prepared water for washing. The reputation of the entire household in the eyes of important, demanding visitors depended on their efficiency. For a job well done, guests often secretly left them small monetary tips. The personal maids of the lady of the house were considered the elite among the female servants. They had legitimate access to the inner sanctum, the ladies' private, luxurious chambers. Their duties included assisting with dressing, styling elaborate hairstyles, and caring for the wardrobe. These women possessed good manners and often knew how to read a little by syllables. They wore elegant black dresses, emulating the style of their incredibly wealthy mistresses. A personal maid was always the keeper of many deep family secrets. She knew her high-ranking mistress's habits, moods, and secrets. Often, a sort of trusting yet very unequal relationship developed between them. However, this closeness could turn into a huge disaster if the lady's mood suddenly changed. The mistress's anger instantly shattered the illusion of friendship, putting the maid back in her place. Work in the laundry stood apart due to the incredible physical strain of the process. The laundresses toiled in a separate wing, hidden behind the dense trees of the large park. They boiled the laundry in huge copper vats, stirring it with heavy wooden tongs. Ironing with red-hot cast iron irons required extraordinary, almost masculine strength. The laundry room was always filled with thick steam and the distinctive smell of wet, hot fabric. The cooks wielded immense, unquestioned authority in their underground domain. They managed the assistants, issuing orders in an incredibly loud and commanding voice. The success of formal dinners and the host's own mood depended on their culinary skills. The cooks jealously guarded their recipes and absolutely would not tolerate strangers in the kitchen. Even the strict housekeeper tried to maintain very good relations with the head cook. The housekeeper's role consisted of total, strict control over this entire operation. She kept meticulous records of food, bars of soap, coal, and expensive candles. Her office was the main control center for the unseen workings of a vast, wealthy estate. The housekeeper personally checked the quality of the cleaning by running a white, clean handkerchief along the shelves. Her authority was unquestionable, and her word was absolute law for all the maids. This structure ensured maximum efficiency with minimal time expenditure. Every cog in this system knew its exact place and its specific daily duties. Overlapping responsibilities were completely ruled out by strict unwritten rules. For years, the girls performed monotonous work, perfecting their movements to the point of pure automatism. As a result, the enormous house shone with impeccable cleanliness, as if by invisible magic.
After you, my dear.
Free time was a rare luxury in the life of any Victorian servant. The workday lasted until the masters retired to their rooms for the night. The only legitimate break was a short rest on Sunday after a hearty lunch. These few hours of freedom were eagerly awaited by the exhausted women throughout the long week. They allowed them to briefly forget about heavy buckets, thick dust, and endless cleaning. On Sundays, the usual rhythm of life at the estate slowed down slightly but noticeably. The masters would go for long walks or relax in their spacious rooms. The maids would finally gather in the kitchen or in their cramped attic bedrooms. They would take out simple sewing kits to carefully mend their torn uniforms. A neat appearance was a prerequisite for keeping their jobs. Many literate young women used this free time to write letters home. They helped their illiterate friends compose short messages to the village. In these letters, they rarely complained about the incredible fatigue and winter cold. On the contrary, they tried to embellish their harsh daily life to reassure their distant relatives. Mail was their only tenuous link to the family home they had left behind. Sometimes the strict housekeeper allowed short walks in the secluded backyard. Going out into the front park or walking in front of the huge windows was strictly forbidden by the rules. The girls could breathe fresh air near the wooden stables or the laundry room. These brief outings into the sun were a real treat for the prisoners of the deep basements. They gathered small wildflowers or simply sat on creaky wooden benches. In the evenings, when all the hard work was done, it was time for conversation in the kitchen. Sitting by the cooling stone hearth, the women shared news and local gossip. They quietly discussed the guests' outfits, the master's whims, and the oddities of other experienced servants. These confidential conversations helped relieve the intense psychological strain after a difficult day. Laughter and soft songs briefly restored their sense of a normal, peaceful life. Reading old newspapers was an incredibly popular pastime among the literate staff. Crumpled issues found their way into the kitchen after the masters had read and discarded them. Articles were slowly read aloud to the women who were completely illiterate. This is how the maids learned about political events in London and the wider world. This window into the wider world provided fodder for long and heated evening discussions. Christmas brought a small, long-awaited respite from the strict routine. On this day, the masters might give the servants scraps of inexpensive fabric for new dresses. In the lower kitchen, a more generous table was set with meat pie and sweet pudding. Work was by no means suspended, but the atmosphere in the vast house became noticeably warmer. These rare moments of joy helped them endure the long, windy, and cold winter. Some young women tried their hand at simple needlework for the sake of aesthetic pleasure. They embroidered simple patterns on handkerchiefs by the dim light of a tallow candle. Yarn was expensive, so they often gathered materials from old discarded scraps. Creating a beautiful item with their own hands restored their fragile sense of self-worth. It was a tiny internal protest against a system that turned them into faceless cogs. However, accumulated fatigue often got the better of any desires or plans for the evening. Instead of chatting or sewing, many preferred to simply lie on the hard iron bed. Regaining physical strength was critically important for the next grueling workday. Back pain and knees worn raw from the floor made themselves felt every spare moment. Rest became a harsh biological necessity rather than a pleasant pastime. For the vast majority of them, a personal life remained a completely unattainable dream. Finding a husband and starting a family of their own without ever leaving the high gates was impossible. Courtship and romance simply did not fit into the rigid schedule of a Victorian maid. They gave their youth to other people's wealthy households, remaining solitary workers forever. All their energy went into maintaining perfect order for people who were completely different from them.
Time for the bell.
At the turn of the 20th century, the British world began to change rapidly and irreversibly. Industrial development created new jobs in large factories and manufacturing plants. Girls from the villages stopped flocking en masse to take on the hard work of serving wealthy lords. Factory work was hard, but it offered a clearly regulated and understandable workday. The main advantage was personal freedom after the shift ended and the long-awaited days off. The mindset of the young, independent generation of British working-class women also changed. They no longer wanted to put up with the constant humiliation and total control of housekeepers. Strict uniform rules and a complete ban on personal life sparked open protest. The status of domestic servants began to rapidly lose its former appeal in society. Finding submissive, silent, and obedient maids became increasingly difficult with each passing year. The aristocracy also faced serious financial difficulties in this new era. Maintaining huge stone mansions required colossal and constant financial outlays. Land taxes rose sharply, while income from agricultural lands fell significantly. Even incredibly wealthy counts could no longer afford to maintain a staff of 50 servants. Mass layoffs began, and unnecessary upper floors in the estates were closed. The advent of new technologies significantly simplified the management of vast estates. The introduction of electricity completely eliminated the need to clean oil lamps every day. Central heating replaced the incredibly arduous manual labor of carrying buckets of coal. The advent of vacuum cleaners and washing machines reduced the need for a large staff of cleaning women. Technological progress gradually rendered the heavy manual labor of invisible maids unnecessary. World War I dealt the final crushing blow to the domestic service system. Women flocked to work in munitions factories and in city hospitals. They realized their independence and their ability to earn a living without having to bow and scrape before their masters. Few wanted to return to sweeping carpets with damp rags after a day's work at the factory. The era of vast domestic staffs came to an end, along with the sounds of gunfire in old Europe. Luxurious country estates gradually emptied and fell into complete disrepair. Without the daily care of dozens of maids, the old houses quickly lost their former luster. Thick dust settled on the mirrors, and the fireplaces remained completely cold through the long winters. Many owners were forced to sell their ancestral homes or hand them over to the state. Huge halls were transformed into quiet and lifeless historical museum exhibits. The memory of the hard labor of thousands of women was gradually erased from official history. The Victorian era is remembered for its glamorous balls, crinolines, and the empire's brilliant victories. The invisible laborers of basements and attics remained only as vague shadows in old photographs. Their names were rarely recorded in the annals, and their lives were considered utterly insignificant. Only the dry ledgers of housekeepers still preserve lists of these faceless workers. Today, the lives of domestic servants are very often romanticized in cinema and popular literature. We are shown beautiful interiors, starched white bonnets, and amusing intrigues among the servants. However, historical reality was devoid of any grace or cinematic glamour. It was a daily exhausting struggle against dust, dampness, and their own incredible fatigue. The real life of a maid consisted of aching joints, wet rags, and ice-cold water.
Mind the kettle, Sarah.
The history of Victorian domestic servants is a very important lesson about the value of human dignity. It clearly shows the enormous price paid for luxury and absolute domestic comfort. Societal progress is measured not only by technical inventions, but also by a humane attitude toward labor. The rejection of slave-like service was an incredibly important step toward modern gender equality. Through their hard, unseen labor, these women paved a long path toward the realization of the importance of freedom. The empty corridors of old mansions still silently echo with the sound of their hurried footsteps. Heavy oak doors no longer conceal the dark secrets of deep class inequality. Mechanical bells have rusted and fallen silent forever, giving way entirely to silence. The relentless passage of time has put everything in its place, dismantling the cruel hierarchy of the 19th century. The memory of their incredible patience and endurance must live on in our hearts forever. How do you assess the contribution of these invisible women to the history of the Victorian era? Please suggest topics in the comments for future videos that you'd like to see on our channel. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on new exciting historical investigations.